Chapter 5. An evanescent trail of smoke drifted lazily from the cigarette sitting on the edge of the ashtray. Fakir picked up the half-burned cigarette, inhaled, and released a stream of the same grayish smoke from between his lips. The street outside was just as gray, as snow had fallen the night before. The wet ice mixing with the grit made the city seem as if it had been covered by frozen ash under the silver full moon. Despite it being Saturday, Fakir continued with his work. On his desk, files lay opened, documents were stacked haphazardly in one corner, and the glossy faces of half a dozen black and white photos glared in the bright electric light from the desk lamp. Fakir picked up one of the photos, showing a geriatric man in a well-tailored suit, surrounded by 3 bodyguards exiting a building. At the bottom of the photo, in Fakir's handwriting, was the name Domenico Corvo, underlined with a sharp, swift stroke. The car license number he had gotten last week had been traced back to Don Corvo, but without a positive ID of who was in the car, there was no way to establish a credible link between the man Duck saw at the crime scene and the head of the Corvo family. Fakir slapped the photo onto the desk. It always came back to him. Principe. Fakir repeated the name in his mind. Leaning back against the hard wooden back of his chair, he thought about the description Duck had given him. Layered white hair, and his skin was fair, almost doll-like. Doll-like. The feeling of déjà vu he had felt when Duck spoke those words to him gave way to a flash of recollection. The grass was lush and the sky was bright. As he crossed the crest of the hill, a white mop of hair appeared, giving way to the back of a boy sitting on the spring grass, his face to the sun. A small noise, the source of which lost to time, made the pale-haired boy turn around, revealing smooth, creamy skin and round amber eyes. Just like a porcelain doll, the ghostly echo of a thought whispered. Fakir's eyes snapped open as his lips gasped. Muto! No, that's impossible. Fakir shook his head mentally, frowned, and tapped the cigarette over the ashtray. He's gone to go study ballet, like he'd always wanted to. He said he was going to New York, and... At this point, Fakir had to physically shake his head several times to try and clear the thought from his mind. This is foolish, he told himself, but even as he tried to convince himself as such, he couldn't completely dismiss the uneasy feeling simmering in his chest. Irritated by this feeling of anxiety, and stiff from sitting in front of his desk for half the day, Fakir sighed and ground out his cigarette. Running his hands through his hair, he realized how tired and grimy he felt, and wondered when was the last time he took a bath. Figuring a shower, even if it was a cold one in the likely scenario that the building's water heater happened to be broken, would help to clear his mind. Fakir turned off the lamp, left a clean shirt on the bed to change into afterward, and went to gather what paraphernalia he needed before heading to the common bathroom down the hallway. Duck, meanwhile, had gone downstairs to pick up her mail and grimaced at the bill she had in her hands.
The electric bill came already? But I haven't gotten my paycheck yet.
She winced.
If I pay the bill, I won't have enough for rent. Maybe I can pay half of the bill for now, but they might charge me for an incomplete payment. Oh!
As Duck worked through her options, she held up her apartment key to her door when suddenly the fuzzy hallway light above her gave out.
Eh!
Duck looked up, and in her moment of surprise, the key fell from her hand and landed with 2 sequential chinks somewhere on the floor.
Oh, drat!
Duck heaved a heavy sigh in the dark. Not knowing where her key might have fallen, Duck peered around her to no avail. As she fumbled blindly in the dark, her feet kicked against something, and she caught a flash of something metallic skid across the floor, disappearing under the door next to her own. Duck couldn't help but let out an exasperated moan. As if paying the bills wasn't problematic enough, she had just locked herself out of her apartment during a blackout, and her key was now somewhere behind Fakir's door. Swallowing her pride, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. Thinking maybe he did not hear her, she knocked again, harder this time, but still there was no reply.
Great! The one time when I need him to be home, he's not here!
Duck crouched down to peer through the crack underneath his door. Squinting her eyes and pressing her cheek flush against the floor, Duck was only able to make out the foot of some table and chairs. Not knowing where Fakir had gone and when he would return, Duck shrank at the thought of waiting in the cold, dark hallway for him or the electricity to return. Her eyes still on the ground in front of Fakir's door, Duck remembered the spare key Fakir left under the thin doormat. She had thought the spare key to be completely unnecessary when Fakir first offered it to her, but this was an emergency, Duck reasoned to herself, and lifted up the rug. The quiet interior of the dining room greeted her as she opened the door. With the electric lights off, the vacant room was dimly illuminated by rectangles of street and moonlight cutting through the frame of the windows. Looking around her, Duck walked slowly into the still apartment. She looked around at the floor, but did not see her key. Venturing further into the apartment, Duck checked under the cabinets and lifted up the skirt of the tablecloth, but found nothing but dust. Straightening her back, she looked behind her at the room across from the front door, which she guessed was Fakir's bedroom. If she had kicked the key hard enough, it was possible the key might have made it all the way in there, but Duck hesitated. She had never been alone in a man's apartment before, much less a man's bedroom. The red-haired young woman blushed involuntarily.
"This is a serious situation,"
she told herself, and she did not care for the idea of spending the night in the hallway because she couldn't locate her key. The floorboards whispered softly as Duck stepped into the bedroom. A single steel-framed bed with neatly made bedding rested in one corner of the room. A tall wooden wardrobe stood guard next to a nightstand at the head of the bed, while a desk was set near the door, behind the foot end of the bed. Duck turned to her left and saw a bookshelf. With the window letting in enough light for her to read by, Duck skimmed the names of half a dozen volumes of legal text, tracing a finger under the solemn titles printed on the book's leather spines. The novelty of being in a stranger's private room firmly distracting her from her task, Duck looked up and down the shelf, but saw not one novel or work of literature.
"I know he's a stiff, but he can't possibly read just law books all the time, can he?" Maybe that explains why he's got such a dour personality,"
Duck mused as her eyes drifted from the shelf to the desk. The photos laid out on the desk piqued Duck's interest, and she walked up for a closer look.
"Domenico Corvo."
She read the name aloud when her eyes alighted on Don Corvo's portrait at the top of the pile.
"So this is the person Fakir's investigating."
Though he was a frail old man, there was an edge to his eyes, evident even in the snapshot of him in daily life. Duck backed away from the pictures, feeling uncomfortable by the knowledge this was the person who ordered the murder she had witnessed. Looking away from the desk, Duck saw what she first thought was a cabinet until she noticed the crank sticking out the side. It was a Victrola phonograph, and judging by the polish of the wood and the shiny brass handle, it was by far the newest piece of furniture in the room. Duck bent down to admire the device, as she had only seen the older horn-type models. Wondering what sort of music Fakir might listen to, an unpromising question, Duck grimaced, if she were to judge his taste based on the contents of his stodgy bookshelf. She looked around her, but didn't see any record cases lying around. Spotting an open cardboard box beside the bookshelf, she wondered if the records might be kept there. Instead, when Duck knelt down beside the box, she found books, only unlike the law books on the shelf, these all appeared to be detective novels.
"The Moonstone. The Mystery of Marie Roget."
Duck could make out the titles of books at the top of the stack, all classical titles for their genre. That answered her question about Fakir's reading habits and alleviated some concerns about his taste. And being a detective himself, detective stories seemed a logical favorite, Duck reasoned as she gingerly picked up one particularly worn-looking book. The novel's pages were yellowed and the edges worn and dog-eared. The paper was also wrinkled, showing signs of water damage.
"He must have had these for a long time."
Duck opened the old novel and saw a line of writing on the inside of the cover. "To our son, Fakir. Happy birthday." Suddenly, footsteps could be heard coming down the hallway. Duck shot up at the sound and, on instinct, looked around frantically for a place to hide. There was the desk, but Fakir would find her as soon as he sat back down to work. Sweeping her eyes out of the room, the space below the dining table offered refuge. Duck started off for the dining room, then realized she was still holding Fakir's book in her hand. Hurriedly putting it back in its box, she scrambled under the tablecloth just as the doorknob turned, and Fakir, grumbling to himself, walked back in. "The one time the water heater works, the electricity goes out. If it's not one thing." His voice faded into the bedroom she was perusing mere seconds ago. Duck lifted an edge of the tablecloth to see Fakir standing with his back to her, a bath towel draped over his bare shoulders. Just as she looked out from her hiding place, lamenting the bind she had gotten herself into, Fakir reached up and pulled the towel away, revealing a wide swath of scar tissue across his back. The scar stretched from his right shoulder, crossed the small of his back, and disappeared beneath the waistline of his drawstring pants. Even in the weak light of the apartment, she could make out the contours of the scar. The scar tissue was taut, and its dark color stood out against Fakir's tanned complexion despite having the appearance of having healed long ago. When he shifted to reach for the shirt left on the bed, Duck could see the scar covered his right shoulder as well as the back of his upper right arm. It was as if liquid flames had been doused across his back, leaving it horribly marked forever. Duck winced, and she abruptly retracted her hand from the tablecloth, feeling at once disquieted and stunned by what she had inadvertently witnessed.
How did he get those scars?
She wondered, but even as part of her pondered the possibilities, she knew it must have been something terrible. Sitting on her knees, Duck lowered her raised hand to the floor, and her fingertips came into contact with something smooth and cold. Duck looked down, and the key that was the cause of her present predicament stared back at her from its hiding spot in the shadow of the table leg, which explained why she didn't spot it earlier during her initial search through the dining room. Relieved to have found her key at last, Duck was momentarily distracted from her thoughts on what she had just seen. She reached for the key, but failed to notice the table leg in front of her. With a thunk, she knocked her head against the wooden leg, drawing a sharp, involuntary "Ow!" from her throat. Fakir jumped at the sudden noise. Reflexively, his hands went from the shirt he had been buttoning to the gun hidden under the pillow. Pointing the Colt revolver at the table, he cocked the gun and demanded firmly, "Whoever's there, come out with your hands up! Now!"
It's me! It's me!
Duck lifted her hands out from under the tablecloth and waved frantically before sticking her head out.
Fakir, it's just me!
At the sight of Duck, Fakir lowered his gun and gasped at her. "What are you doing here?" The thought that followed had him tightening his grip around the weapon as he grew tense again. "Did something happen? Did you notice something suspicious?" Hurriedly, Duck shook her head, the sight of the loaded gun only heightening her nervousness.
No! I just lost my key when the lights went out. I accidentally kicked it under your door in the dark, and when I knocked and you didn't answer, I used the spare key to come in to look. But then you came back in, and I panicked, and I hid under the table."
Her trail of explanation ended abruptly as she didn't know what else to say to him. She tried to meet his eyes, but her eyes involuntarily drifted to the scar underneath his half-buttoned shirt. Duck abruptly turned around and groped for the front door knob.
But I found it now, so I'll be going back then. Goodbye!
And with that, she dashed out of the apartment as fast as she could, jerking the door shut behind her. Fakir sighed and took his finger off the trigger before putting the gun down on the desk. "Moron," he said with an exasperated shake of his head. But something about the way Duck looked before she sped out of the room gave Fakir pause. She was looking straight at him, he reflected, except not at his face, but at his torso. Fakir's hands clutched the front of his half-opened shirt shut, his eyes narrowed. "It doesn't matter," he told himself resolutely before his fingers unclutched the fabric and returned to their task of buttoning up the shirt. "She doesn't know anything." Duck rushed back inside her apartment like a rabbit diving back into its burrow, nearly forgetting to pick up the letter she had left outside in the hallway. Once the door was closed, Duck buried her face in her palms and moaned into her hands.
Stupid! I was staring so obviously, he must have noticed!
Though she might be scatterbrained at times, Duck had enough sense to know a scar like that wasn't something someone would want others to see, and even though she had seen it unwittingly, Duck couldn't help but feel guilty about it, particularly when she had stared at it so conspicuously before making her quick retreat. As her mood took a downward spiral, a light music began to play, just audible above the background noise of the city. Duck removed her hands from her face, lifting her gaze to look out the window. The notes conjured a memory of a graceful figure dancing in a room walled by mirrors and lined by wooden bars. As a little girl with large blue eyes wide in wonder, she had watched the figure jump and twirl. Duck's feet moved away from the door as she followed the musical trail to her bedroom window. Sliding the panel open, the young woman put her head out and a piano solo greeted her ears. except it was not played crisp and clear as on an instrument, but with the slight scratchiness of a phonograph. Fakir sat by his window as the music trickled past him into the night. He had a towel draped over his shoulders and his elbow propped up on the sill as he smoked. At the sound of Duck opening her window, he glanced at her and said disinterestedly, "What are you doing out here in the cold?" Duck tensed. The awkwardness from earlier once again lifted its head, and she fought back the urge to shut her window and hide behind her curtains.
You see, the music,
she managed at last.
I was just reminded how it sounds like the music my mother used to dance to.
With his eyes trained on the street below them, Fakir gave his cigarette a tap, letting the ash float down to the snow down below. What was her name? Duck blinked several times in surprise, as if she hadn't expected Fakir to respond, before answering,
Elsa.
Fakir blew a puff of smoke through his lips and raised his brows. That's not a very Irish-sounding name.
My grandpa was German. He traveled throughout Europe collecting folk stories and fairy tales, and ended up settling in Ireland where I was born.
As she spoke, Duck relaxed, and some of her usual indignation at Fakir's goading found its way back into her voice.
But it's not like your name sounds very Spanish-like either.
I am not Spanish, Fakir said curtly. My family is Portuguese. There is a big difference between the two.
Oh.
Duck fell silent for a moment, then asked,
So what does it mean?
What does what mean?
Your name, Fakir. What does it mean?
Fakir didn't answer, and Duck was starting to wonder if he wasn't going to when he said quietly, It's an Arabic word. It means someone who has miraculous abilities. Duck's brows knotted together at his explanation.
But you just said you're Portuguese.
I am, Fakir snapped exasperatedly.
But you said your name is Arabic.
Fakir heaved a long sigh and took a puff of his cigarette. When he spoke, his voice was soft, softer than Duck had ever heard him before. My mother gave me my name. She's Moorish, which means she's Arabic, Fakir clarified when he saw Duck's expression descending into confusion once again.
Oh, I see,
Duck nodded in feigned comprehension.
But what does...
Before Duck could continue with her question, Fakir cut her off. Aren't you cold? It's winter and you're letting the cold air into your apartment. He rubbed out the spent cigarette on the concrete sill. Now go back inside before you catch a cold. Duck stood there, agape at the sudden dismissal. Pointing her finger at him, she huffed,
You should talk! Your hair's still damp, but you've been sitting out here longer than I have!
What I do is of no concern to you, Fakir answered dismissively. But this time his imperious attitude failed to intimidate Duck. Taking a chair from her room, she sat down defiantly in front of her window, and Fakir could do little more than glare at her.
Don't think just because you're a cop you can boss me around!
She folded her arms on the chilly sill and rested her chin in her arms.
And I want to listen to the music some more,
she said more quietly, her voice muffled by her sleeves.
The song you're playing brings back memories of Ma when I was young.
Fakir showed no sign of moving from his spot either, and reached into his pocket and tapped out another cigarette. Are they good memories? He asked, striking a flame on the lighter. Duck smiled at the gray but beautiful city, at the pedestrians traversing through the street below them, and at the music that buoyed her memories.
Yes, they are. Back then, Ma worked at Mr. Coton's point shoe store during the day and taught ballet at the Crown Dance Studio at night. Before I was old enough to stay home by myself, I would go to the studio after school and watch. Ma used to be a ballerina back in Ireland. She once played the lead role in a production of Swan Lake, and that's a role only a true prima donna can perform. Besides her skills, she was also a really nice person, so all of her students loved her very much and really enjoyed her classes. Ma also tried to teach me to dance, but I didn't have the talent she had.
At this, Duck chuckled and scratched her cheek sheepishly.
In fact, I was so bad some of her students didn't believe I was her daughter at first. I can't blame them, though. Even though I look a lot like Ma, I'm her complete opposite. Sometimes I even wonder...
Duck uncharacteristically demurred before she continued in a small voice.
I wonder if it's because of me that Ma stopped dancing professionally.
Fakir studied Duck, but the young woman did not notice his eyes on her. Why do you think that? Duck frowned.
I don't know. It's just, Ma was doing really well back in Europe. She was a budding young prima donna, but retired when she had me.
Duck's thoughts drifted to the signed photograph of her mother as Odette.
If she didn't have me, and if she hadn't passed away when she did, I'm sure she would be famous now. Because of me, Ma gave up what she loved. Gave up her future because of me. Because of me.
The thought quivered in Duck's heart, resonating with echoes of regret.
If Ma hadn't worked so hard to raise me, she might not have gotten sick, and she would still be here today, smiling, dancing, living.
You're thinking too much. Duck looked up at Fakir, startled by his clear, certain tone.
How do you know that that's...
This time she was once again cut off by Fakir, who shifted in his position by the window, but kept his gaze turned to the black-blue velvet night sky. Parents love their children more than anything. If your mother gave up her career, it must mean she loved you more than dance, that you were more important to her than fame. Duck unfolded her arms and looked at the worn toe shoes and photographs sitting on the cabinet. The woman in the Odette costume was beautiful and graceful, but the woman Duck knew, the one who shared a warm smile and a gentle, steady embrace with her, was the woman Duck knew as her mother. There was no question in Duck's mind that her mother loved her. That was a truth as solid as bedrock, as certain as the cycling seasons. Duck did not know if her mother would have been happier had she continued with her career, but what the young woman did know was that her mother was happy, and Duck was happy. The music on the phonograph wound to a stop, leaving only the skipping noise of the stylus running on the edge of the record. Fakir stirred and left his window side perch. Well, that's it. Or do you intend to keep sitting there and catch pneumonia? Duck shuffled the chair back and sat up reluctantly, but her eyes were bright and clear again as she said,
Fine, I'm going. Still,
she faced Fakir and smiled sincerely.
I really enjoyed the music. It was nice listening to the Victrola.
Fakir, who was in the process of closing his window, stopped and looked at Duck askance. Wait, how do you know the phonograph is a Victrola? Duck froze as she realized she had just given herself away.
Oh, I guessed!
She laughed nervously.
They're pretty popular, so I thought maybe that's the model you have.
Fakir looked at her darkly, and Duck felt herself beginning to sweat despite the cold air. At last Fakir dismissed the matter and shrugged. In a gruff voice, he muttered, "Good night," and closed his window.
Good night!
Duck squawked. Behind her, the dining room light blinked several times before turning back on, and the darkness in the apartment beat a hasty retreat. By now, the cold had edged its frosty tendrils throughout her apartment, and Duck moved quickly to close her window. She paused and gave Fakir's window one last look. Duck decided, despite his prickly nature, it seemed Fakir wasn't such a bad person after all. Smiling, she pulled the pane down and drew the curtains on this eventful evening. The following Sunday morning was crisp and cool. A lone figure approached 1750 Lake Avenue, stopping just short of the steps. Dressed in a woolen coat and hat, a leather briefcase in hand, the young man adjusted the glasses on the bridge of his nose as he cast critical violet eyes over the building's aged brick facade. Retrieving a crisply folded note from his coat pocket, the bespectacled young man read out, Fakir Ramirez, apartment 514, 1750 Lake Avenue. Having double-checked the address, a sparkle entered the young man's eyes, not altogether from the reflected light of the rising sun, as he smiled and ascended the steps into the apartment building.